Do you remember the last time that you approached the Bible and saw something that you wouldn't typically look for? Most of us, we have a congregation with a lot of different levels and degrees of experience with the Bible. Some of us have just barely cracked the book. We don't know our way from Exodus to Leviticus. Others of us have studied the Bible for years and we're just about memorizing it from the time that we were in diapers. But no matter how long you've been around the Bible, most of us can agree that it's a pretty good source for inspiration. Right? There are things that we can read in the Bible that put into words conversations with God that we wish we could have, ways of phrasing a description of our human experience that we just didn't think of yet. Most of us can agree that the Bible is generally a good book to read for inspiration. The Word of God, inspired by God, and inspiring to us. And if you spend any level of time around the Bible, sooner or later, you're going to find some things that are less inspiring. Things as you read, looking for inspiration, you end up finding things that are unsettling. Something that makes you go, something that gives you pause, something that makes you reconsider what you thought you already knew. If you're really trying to understand the Bible, if you're really trying to live the Bible, the honest truth is that the Bible can sometimes stir up things in us instead of settling them down. If you're not careful about which passages you read, the Bible can cause all sorts of trouble. And so lately, maybe just for the past year or so, I've kept reading the Bible looking for inspiration. But I've also been reading the Bible looking for trouble. And I've found it. There are passages in Scripture, some I've looked for and some I haven't, that deeply trouble me. Sometimes because I'm missing some context and need somebody more educated to help me out. Sometimes because I'm afraid I'm reading it wrong. And other times I'm troubled because I think I may be reading the Bible correctly and seeing something in God's character that I would really prefer to ignore. Today's passage has seemed, at least to me, for the longest time, to be one of the more troubling passages in the Bible. And it starts with the main character. Often we pass right over Jacob in the Bible, but Jacob was the second of two twins. His older brother Esau was born first, and he was born clutching on to Esau's heel. And so they gave him a name that was essentially, roughly translated, the one who grabs, or grabber for short. And he pretty much lived up to his name. When his father was about to die, Jacob's mother helped him steal his older brother Esau's birthright as the oldest son. In this culture, if you were the oldest son, you got an inheritance, you got a privileged position in the family. All of it Jacob took by deceiving his father. And so Esau comes in, discovers that Jacob has stolen his birthright, and says, as any brother would, I'm going to kill you when our dad dies. And Jacob, as any brother would, believes him. And so he runs away in a far country, serves as a ranch hand on his uncle's farm, becomes a shareholder in that farm, and after years was married to one woman he didn't really want to be married to, and then was married to a second woman that he actually wanted to be married to. And he received over these years promise after promise after promise from God, passed from his grandfather to his father to him, that God would bless his descendants, and in the words of Genesis, make them as numerous as the sands of the sea, which cannot be counted. And Jacob believes those too. He has the wife and the land and the children that he wanted, and yet he's always, as he's receiving promises and fulfillment from God, looking over his shoulder to see when that brother that he stole all this from is going to come down the road seeking revenge. And so Jacob is troubling, if only because he has the shiftiness of a con man and the prayer life of a saint. And so when this story takes place, Jacob is about to face his worst fear. He's about to meet Esau. And so he sends messengers ahead of him with hundreds of livestock and other gifts. And he says to the messengers, tell Esau that you're giving these gifts to him so that he may look favorably upon me. This is Christmas at some of your houses, right? And they do, right? The messengers give the gifts, they return, and this is what they say. They say, we went to your brother Esau, and he's now coming to meet you. Good news so far. And 400 men are with him. Uh-oh. This is not the moment that Jacob was looking for. This is not the news for sure that he was looking to receive. So Jacob goes back into self-preservation mode. He splits his estate into two halves. One with one of his wives, Rachel, the other with one of his wives, Leah, half of his children, half of his servants, half of his livestock. He breaks them into two camps and puts at the head of the camps people bearing gifts, quote, hoping to pacify Esau's anger. And after he's done this, he sends both camps forward across a stream toward Esau while he goes back across the stream, safe from whatever's about to go down, so he can see how this goes. And frankly, probably trying to go with whichever camp had the best chance at getting away. This guy is calculating, and this guy is shrewd. This guy is also praying in the desert, deliver me from the hand of my brother. And he's anxious, preparing for what he's sure is going to be a fight with a brother who promised to kill him. But before he can get into a fight with Esau, he's jumped in the night by somebody else, which we later discover is actually God. And that's the first troubling thing that I'm going to draw attention to in this passage. It's God's approach. I've read the Bible for long enough to know that when God's around, things are theoretically supposed to get better. A few of you have read through the Bible a little bit, and so you know the Sunday school highlights. God's work consists of parting seas so people can walk through and calming the storm so the people won't die. God's supposed to be the one who heals and loves and delivers and offers blessings that feel like blessings. Or at least that's supposed to be the way it goes. The way that you know God is with you and is when your heart rate gets lower and you avoid the bad thing that almost happened. When your anxiety goes away, when you're filled with a peace that passes all understanding, when things in your life that seem to be fraying apart come back together, those are the moments where you say, that was a God thing. But that's not the way that Jacob experiences God. This is a story about God coming out under the cover of night to beat a human being up. You ever hear a passage where it's really hard to say, thanks be to God? It strikes me that when Jacob is fighting just to breathe, using every muscle in his body not to be taken down, that God's nearness doesn't feel to him like it's coming in the way that most of us would pray for. Make no mistake, God is close to Jacob, but there is no peace that passes all understanding. It doesn't feel like his life is falling into place. It feels like he's in a fight to see whether or not he's going to live at all, because he is. That troubles me. If somebody submitted the manuscript of Genesis for me to edit, this would be one that I would consider leaving out, just because we don't want people who believe in God and obey, some sort of level of have some sort of level of obedience to his promises, to think that if they obey, if they accept and believe the promises of God, that God could beat them up at night, right? I would leave it out. It's troubling. It's confusing. No. But it's in the book. We're not going to resolve that. The second is God's hiddenness. Another thing that troubles me is how long it took for Jacob to recognize that he was wrestling with God, right? Even the text seems a little bit hesitant to say it at first. Verse 22 says, Jacob was left alone and a man wrestled him till daybreak. That in itself is a little bit weird. My kids have 3 young boys. They wrestle quite a bit, but they always seem to need to break for water at about the 20-minute mark. And so I just think all night, sure, that's weird enough. But what's even stranger to me is that it takes almost until the end of the fight for Jacob to realize that the person that he's grappling with is different than any other person he's ever fought with before. He doesn't recognize it until the man that he's wrestling with gives him a new name. Because in this culture, to rename someone means that you have some level of position and authority. You're able to convey or to confer a new name that wipes the old name away. And so Jacob says, who are you? Essentially, by what authority are you able to rename me? It takes that long. This is almost like verse 30-ish until Jacob sort of catches a whiff of heaven on the person that he's wrestling. And call me old-fashioned, but when God's moving, I just don't want it to be that subtle. I'd like to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that God's moving. Some of you know this about me because we've had any level of conversation in the past few years at all. But some of this is probably because of my job. Some of it's because of my temperament. But I have a very strong reluctance to ever say for sure if something is definitely from God. Because I'm suspicious of myself. And I'm suspicious of people who all too often confuse God's will with their own preferences. I've been that person, you've been that person, other people. There are people who go around all the time saying, God wants it that way, or God's opinion is clear about this, or college students, God told me to break up with you. And sometimes God may even really have said these things, but usually when a person says this, what they're conveying is not all that much about God at all. Usually what they're doing is hiding their own preferences behind spiritual language, signing God's name on their own bad checks. And so unless I know that something is from God, I don't say anything. I don't want to put a dent in God's reputation by my own human foolishness, which is why I'm troubled, frankly, that God was close enough to Jacob to pin him down on the ground and Jacob didn't know for sure who he was wrestling with. What's your name? Says Jacob. And God replies sort of coyly, why are you asking? That's troubling for most of us, isn't it? That someone who has received and believed and lived into the promises of God could come face to face with God without knowing it. The third thing that's troubling in this passage, to me and to most of us as we read, is God's unworthy choice. I don't know about your upbringing. I know about some of your upbringing, but not everybody's corporate upbringing here. But I know many of us were raised to think that there were some advantages to living a righteous life when it comes to experiencing God's presence. I was taught from a pretty young age that when we live in God's ways, we're more likely to receive connection with God. But Jacob is no saint. This is a conniving cheat who's living under a stolen blessing. He has a high level of self-preservation and a low level of remorse. And even if it's not entirely a pleasant moment that he has with God, he gets more of a moment with the divine than you and I do, more than Mother Teresa did, more than many of the apostles did. And if you have any radar for fairness at all, something just doesn't seem right about that. Some of us might want to call up God's complaint department and tell God that he shouldn't be so tight with this kind of morally corrupt crowd because he's setting a bad example for our children. But God's calendar of appointments puts him into contact with people who are far off the straight and narrow, and who remind us that God's table includes a lot of people who are not yet bearing the family resemblance. Maybe it's a helpful moment to just pause a story and say that perhaps this part of the passage is most troubling to most of us because it exposes how often we believe that God doles out his love because we've earned it by our good behavior. God doesn't do that. There are no merit badges for righteous living because living in intimacy with God is its own reward. You don't have to look over your shoulder or keep track of your lies quite so much. But the problem is that sometimes the further into holiness we go, the more tempted we are to forget that God loves people who aren't yet cleaned up and says to them, as he does to Jacob and through Jesus to us, I will be with you wherever you go. And that's all well and good until God starts going with people wherever they go that I don't want to go with. And then I would cut it out of the book if I was editing it. But it's in there. There's one more final troubling thing that's been just nibbling at me as I've read this passage over the course of the past several weeks. And that's the fact that God at the same time blesses Jacob and gives him an injury that lasts for the rest of his life. Later references to Jacob say that he had to lean on his staff just to stand upright. There are references to other people around Jacob having to do things for him because he was unable to do them for himself. And growing up, I was raised with a pretty simple rule that many of you are probably familiar with: leave a place better than you found it. It's a simple idea that I think a lot of us are familiar with, either because we've been parented this way or we are parenting this way. And the idea is that part of our responsibility is that wherever we show up, to steward and to tend that space, to make sure that our presence is a benefit and not a drain. It's just the way I was raised. And so pardon me for thinking that God works the same way. And yet here God is, as far as I can tell, leaving Jacob worse than he found him. God blesses him, I'll give you that. But in the process, he gives Jacob an injury that would make every activity that he previously took for granted much more difficult. And so I keep wondering as I read through this passage, what does it mean for a God who loves you more than anything to bless you at the same time as he gives you a wound? Something about that doesn't sit well with me. I don't like it, I'm confused by it. If I was editing the book, I'd leave it out. And the four things that we just addressed are just a small sample size of the troubling things in this passage and passages that are adjacent to it in the Bible. They make most of us uncomfortable. And whenever we stumble on things in the Bible that make us uncomfortable, it's worth pausing, because sometimes discomfort is a side door into our values. You can tell a lot about a person based on what makes them unsettled, based on what makes them uncomfortable, based on which part of the books of the Bible they just want to go, whoop, let's move right past it. Maybe this is a good time to pause the sermon for a moment and say that often these four things make us uncomfortable, not because they're in conflict with God's nature, but because they're in conflict with a vision of God that's too small to be real. We've had hundreds of our people in our congregation and in the reach of this church over the course of the past several years walk through deconstruction, some through reconstruction, because they could no longer believe in the God that they were raised to believe in. Because many in the church are raised with a vision of God that's too frail to stand the test of time, raised to believe that God is primarily interested in keeping the young people out of trouble and the older people healthy, convicting our enemies and blessing our friends, making sure our candidate gets into the White House and our sports teams get to the championships. Many of us have come up believing in a God that could never convict us because he already believes the same way we do. That vision of God can't wrestle with you. And so it's no wonder that many of us, when we encounter pain, feel abandoned by God and like our only option is to stop believing. The problem is a lot of people who say they now don't believe in God don't believe in the same God that the Bible rejects. And that's when this passage started to feel like maybe, thanks be to God, it was making a turn toward being good news. Because it helps us lay down the God that we've made in our own image and invites us into the brutal pain of wrestling with a God who actually exists. So if it's okay with you, let's go there. Let's talk about some things that we don't always talk about in a space like this. First, for some of us, our pain comes from God's approach. There are specific situations in our lives that we ask God to prevent, and God didn't prevent them. We're doing everything we can to live in God's ways, but instead of feeling like life is improving, it actually feels like our life is getting worse somehow. We expected God to step in and heal and protect and shelter us from exactly the kind of things that we're facing. We're bruised by God. We're afraid for our lives. We're wondering, what's the difference between a God who causes us harm and a God who could prevent harm but chooses not to? We have a vision in our head that when God works in a situation, things get smoother and simpler. But sadly, the Bible, in our lived experience, won't back it up. Just about every page you turn in the Bible is another faithful person plunged into chaos by the very presence of God. Paul is knocked off his horse. Noah's thrust into construction management while people heckle him. Abraham is forced to uproot his entire family and move someplace new that God didn't give him a map for. Mary is pregnant in a way that exposes her to public shame. The apostles are drowned and hanged and brought before trial at every turn they take. And here's Jacob tackled by a divine wrestler, and much like us, fearing for his life, partly because he thought he was alone, and partly because he forgot that the promises of God are not contingent on the journey being pleasant. Only God being present. Sometime before God promised Jacob, he said, I'll be with you, I'll protect you, and I'll bring you back to the land where I've met with you before. But when the fighting got intense, Jacob forgot that promise and was pretty convinced that God had to. He thought, this is where it ends. I'm not going to make it back to the place I was promised. I think there are some of us this morning who need to hear the good news according to Jacob. God is faithful to remember his promises, even when we forget. Later on, Jacob made it back to the place that the Lord promised him, hobbling as he went, but he made it. Some of us are feeling mystified by God's hiddenness. There are some of us in this congregation for whom spiritual life just feels strangely unspiritual. We're not sure who we're wrestling with here. We're just in a fight against the cold, impersonal forces of a world that feels like it's trying to kill us. We hope our kids are growing up well, but we have no guarantees. We're hoping to spend our days wisely. We're reading the Bible. We're participating in the sacraments. We're heading to work and treating people with integrity. We're praying and going to church. We just wonder why it is that God can't be counted upon to show up in the places that we're showing up. I've been captivated this week by the fact that even after Jacob asks, God never chooses to reveal his name. Jacob asks his name, and as we talked about earlier and saw depicted on the screen, God says, why do you need to know? And that's been such a strange question for me until an Old Testament scholar friend of mine said, God chose not to answer Jacob because he wants him to know that every interaction he has may be an encounter with the very presence of God. It's a theme that the New Testament picks up on when the author of Hebrews says, don't forget to show hospitality to strangers because some have entertained angels without knowing it. In other words, church, the good news, according to Jacob, is that God is drawing near to us in 1,000 ways, most of which we flat out miss. God doesn't always require you to name it, just to stay curious. Our task is to be open to the idea that every face we see, the people we love, the people we wrestle with, the people we walk right by, may be for us the very face of God if we have the attention to pay and the hearts to receive it. Some of us are struggling with the third item, God's unworthy choice. Many of us are wondering why in the world God would involve us in his plan for redemption, given all the reasons that we're unqualified. Others of us are wondering why in the world God would bless those other people, whoever the other people in your world are, who haven't yet earned God's attention. The nice thing, even if it's really hard news, the nice thing to just think about when you're on your pillow at night is that God only has fallen people to work with. You may be at a point in your journey toward holiness where you wonder why on earth God would choose you, or you might be at a point in your journey toward holiness when you're tempted to wonder what God was thinking, putting somebody at his table that you wouldn't choose to have at yours. But as hard as it is for us to accept it, Jacob's story shows us that God's table is bigger than ours. The odds are there's a moment that you've just been through or a moment that you're going to come through soon where you or somebody you know feels beyond the reach of God. And so it's a really good idea to remember back in this passage just how long God's reach is. The good news, according to this story, is that God doesn't love us because we're good. God loves us because we're his children. And God delights in giving good gifts to his children. But it might come with a limp. Some of us are wounded or are struggling with God's way of blessing and wounding. Earlier in the chapter, in a part that we didn't read, Jacob cries out to God and says, "Save me from the hand of my brother Esau, because I'm afraid of him. He may come and attack me and the mothers who are with my children. Save me, I pray, from his hand." And right after this passage, Jacob, no longer hiding on his own in the wilderness, hobbles off to the head of his two families that he's divided into camps to face the brother that he's feared for so long. And because of the limp, scholars say, Esau sees him from a far distance and thinks, this brother of mine is not coming to me to take advantage of me again. He can barely keep himself straight, standing up. And so the brothers embraced, and there was reconciliation that eliminated years and years of tension and strife. Jacob hobbled on through the rest of his life, being delivered over and over and over, not just from the hand of Esau, but from all kinds of tight circumstances, because God provided the deliverance he asked for in a way that he didn't ask for. There are some of us this morning who have asked God to come through in our life in very specific ways and have found that God has not. And at the same time, there is in Jacob's life and in our life the possibility that God will still yet, even if we can't see it, bring his purposes to completion, even if it's in ways that we wouldn't choose. And yet, yes, even if the tremendous pain that we have doesn't go away. The good news then, according to Jacob, is that God still has surprising ways of bringing deliverance, not from our wounds, but through them. It may be a help for those of us who are wrestling with God in this moment to realize that God didn't provide Jacob in that moment with perspective. God doesn't provide someone off to the side during the wrestling match saying, "Hey, you can't see it now, but this is going to be a great thing later on." He didn't say, "Excuse me, at least God spared your life." There's no bumper sticker from God to cover over the real pain that's here. There's just a limp. Maybe worth it for those of us who tend to be the issuers of bumper sticker theology to remember that God will deliver perspective when God chooses to deliver perspective. Our journey is to help people stay in the wrestle. Back to the sermon. Eventually, the people of God would take on the name that God gave Jacob, which is one who wrestles or strives with God, as their identity. The whole nation of Israel would carry on this identity, reminding those of us who through Jesus have been adopted in the family of God that disciples are those who strive with God and sometimes walk away with a limp. The challenge, if you're wrestling with any of the four that we've just talked about, is that the good news doesn't take away the pain of wrestling with God. And so for weeks, I've wondered what would be a fitting way to close a sermon where the resolution just frankly cannot happen on a Sunday morning. And then a friend pointed out something this week in this passage that I hadn't ever seen before. He said, at first, Jacob is fighting like mad to get out of the grip of the man who's wrestling him until the deep pain of his hip sets in. And then in the midst of the pain, he clings to God for all he's worth because he's in no man's land. And he knows that even if holding on causes him pain, if he lets go of the one he's wrestling with, he'll never make it out alive. I know that there are some of us in this congregation this morning who are in the middle of wrestling with God, and we're just trying to stay in the fight. There are moments when God's calling us out of something familiar and easier into something unknown. There are moments when our childhood beliefs about God are aging poorly into our life experience, and we're standing in the present wondering whether we should discard the stuff that we've believed or if we should press in and find new ways to believe again. There are some moments when by age or health or accident, we're unable to do the things that we used to be able to do and wonder whether we're useful to God or useful to anybody else. There are moments when we've been wronged in relationships by people who are close to us, and we're clutching on to resentment that's poisoning us because we're afraid to forgive. There are moments when we ourselves have wronged another person and know that the right thing to do would be to reach out and try to reconcile, but are unable to look over our shoulder or into the eyes of a person that we've caused that deep hurt toward. Moments when life keeps hitting us and hitting us and hitting us, and we're left wondering why God doesn't intervene in situations when we really need to come through. Some of you have been wrestling with one or all of these things. Most of you have been doing it totally alone. Afraid to admit it because you're afraid people will see your wrestling as a sign that you're not all that spiritual after all. That you don't have your life together. People may tell you that if it was really God that you were wrestling with, it wouldn't be so hard. Hear my language. One of the strongest things that Christians can do is to stop pretending and lean into the body. Our vocation as disciples is, among other things, to strive with God until we receive a blessing. So if you're wrestling with God this morning, what I'm going to invite you to do is step out and come to the altar and admit, maybe for the first time, that the match is on at your house. That you're in the middle of the hard and painful struggle of laying down the God that you used to believe in, the God that looks a lot like you. And then at the same time, you're committing this morning, even as you wrestle, to hold on to God and to let the body help you stay in that fight even when it feels like you can barely hold on. And as you come, my hope is that others of you who are part of this body and you've been in seasons of this kind of wrestling before will come up and surround those who are in it now and help them know they're not alone. So church, the altar is open this morning to anyone who's right now wrestling with God, who would say, God being my helper and the church being my companion, I will hold on to the God who's wrestling me until I get the blessing.